our, our principal, Professor Archibald MacDonald, our deputy principal, Professor Ishan Kumbakawa, PVC for Graduate Studies and Research, my good friend, Professor Dale Weber. Our honoree today, Chancellor Emeritus Sir George Alleyne and Lady Alleyne, members of faculty, members of our former and present executive and senior management, members of former dean, now I see over there, Professor, am I seeing the right person? Former dean of the Faculty of Medical Sciences, welcome. Other members of the, I was going to say of the fraternity, but I should really formally say, other members of our Faculty of Medical Sciences, great to see you, members of staff, members of faculty, other invited guests, good evening. I didn't hear that. Thank you, thank you. It is certainly my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to our final event for our Grand Homecoming Week. We've had an exciting time this week as we celebrate not just another commemoration or another homecoming, but it is our 70th anniversary. So it is particularly important this year and particularly exciting this year. We've had a number of very, very thrilling and exciting events. We're starting off with our church service on Sunday. On Monday, we launched an exhibition on Sir George in the Mona Library. And I'm hoping it is still available, Dr. Carr, yes, for those to come next week even to look at that really outstanding exhibition on the work and life of Sir George Alleyne. And then on Tuesday, we were delighted to host Sir George as we named our newest Hall of Residence in his honor. So our newest Hall of Residence is the George Alleyne Hall of Residence. On Thursday, that's yesterday, right? Yes, on Thursday, we had our university parade and flag raising ceremony. And I think it's the grandest we've had. I have never seen so many students out at any of our homecoming parades and the flag raising ceremonies. I know it was a long day. We finished at about 7. We normally end at 5:36. But it was good, and our honoree was delighted to be there with Lady Alleyne again. We really tired. Yesterday was a tiring day, wasn't it? Yes, but we were happy to have you, and the students were happy to have you. The students were especially glad because the homecoming champion hall was Taylor Hall. And yeah, right. And so they said, well, you look at this. They wanted to say especially that our principal is a Taylorite, and our honoree is a Taylorite. So they thought it was just fitting in our 70th year that Taylor Hall took away the homecoming 70th anniversary prize for that evening. So this year we are pleased to have our honoree with our public lecture, and he will be speaking this evening. As you know, we have it here, and I'm just wanting to make sure I get the words right, and it's gone. It is Framing the Faces of Health. Today and beyond, Sir George? I'm not seeing, oh, good, right. Framing the Faces of Health, and so we're really pleased that he is here. I must recognize, she doesn't like it, but I'm going to recognize Professor Elsa Leorini, who was our honoree 2 years ago and did our lecture here. Last year we had Professor Don Robotham, and so the lecture series is fairly new for us. We've had it, I think, for the last 4 years, and it has proven to be very, very successful and meaningful indeed. So we're very happy to have you with us today. It's my pleasure now to invite our principal, who will bring you remarks and welcome for the evening. So let's invite Professor MacDonald to come to the podium at this time.
Campus Registrar, Sir George and Lady Alleyne, PVC Weber, Deputy Principal Kawa, and Deputy Principal of the Open Campus, Professor Meeks, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, friends, Good evening. African-American civil rights activist and leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who addressed the UWI graduating class of 1965 here on the Mona campus, once said, "We are not the makers of history. We are made by history." Dr. King's statement is profound, not only to the global family of people of African descent as we observe Black History Month, but aptly describes a key characteristic of our homecoming week of celebrations. We must never neglect to make the link between the past, our present, and our future. To do so is to weaken the foundation on which we seek to build sustainable growth, increase impact, and achievement. As an institution, we believe in honoring and documenting the stories and journeys of key figures who have contributed to the UWI, our respective countries, the region, and indeed the world. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, alumni, it gives me great pleasure to join you in honoring the remarkable achievements of our distinguished homecoming 2018 honoree, Sir George Alan Moore O'Garen Alleyne. Applaud him. Born to industrious parents in 1932 in St. Philip, Barbados, he came to the University of the West Indies and graduated as the gold medalist in 1957. His subsequent pursuits in postgraduate training in internal medicine in the United Kingdom and the United States would set him firmly on the path to becoming professor of medicine in 1972 and head of the Department of Medicine 4 years later. As chancellor, he left an indelible mark on the UWI at all levels. Besides his academic experience, Sir George has been a true changemaker in various roles regionally and internationally, which are well documented to include his service at Pan American Health Organization, Regional Office of the World Health Organization, and the United Nations, among others. It therefore gives us great pride and much pleasure to join this distinguished gentleman and scholar as he presents the annual Homecoming Celebrations public lecture at this special moment in the history of the UWI. As we look to 70 more years of excellence in scholarship, teaching, and research, there is no better person to address us at this time as we seek to shape new visions, hopes, and dreams for an even more vibrant and productive UWI over the next so many years, maybe 70 years. Our students in particular must understand the critical need for impact beyond the walls of our campuses. I look forward, Sir George, to a thought-provoking, stimulating, and inspirational address from our most deserving honoree. Thank you, and I'm certain you will enjoy the evening's lecture.
Thank you very much, Principal. As we recognize the presence of the Honorable P.J. Patterson arriving now, we want to thank you for being with us. We're now going to invite the Irving Hall Choir, who will perform for us. The performance piece is called Pelican Proud, and it's an excerpt from the US 70th musical Bone of Contention, presented by the Torchlight Players. Let's welcome Irving Hall. Let's hear it again for Irving Hall. It's my pleasure now to introduce to you a gentleman who needs no introduction. However, the principal has told you quite a bit about our Chancellor Emeritus. Let me add a few words to that. Emeritus, as you know, is used when a person of distinction in a profession retires, but is allowed to retain that title because of the significant achievements that person has had in his or her experience. Achieving Professor Emeritus, Director Emeritus, and now distinguished Chancellor Emeritus speaks volumes of the work of the Honorable Sir George Alleyne. Sir George Alleyne was born in Barbados, as we were told, and he spent his early childhood in a coastal village called Merricks in the parish of St. Philip. He developed a thirst for knowledge at a very early age, and as a result performed remarkably throughout his school life. In 1950, Sir George won the Barbados Scholarship in Classics and proceeded the following year to this campus as the first Barbadian scholarship winner to attend university. Although he was a dedicated student of medicine, Sir George was no bookworm, as we all know. As he played football, he went cycle racing and was even among the first to go swimming in the new campus pool. He was indeed a well-rounded and most well-adjusted student at Mona. As a son of the UWI soil, he is a proud alumnus. Upon graduation with a degree of Bachelor of Medicine and Surgery from the then University College of the West Indies, Sir George Alleyne had won the Allenbury Prize for Clinical Medicine, the University Silver Medal for Medicine, and the University Gold Medal for the Best Clinical Student. In 1963, he joined the staff of the Tropical Metabolism Research Unit, where he spent 9 years carrying out important research in areas such as the nutritional problems of children, renal and electrolyte disorders, and renal biochemistry. He was appointed Professor of Medicine in UWI in 1972 and Chair of the Department of Medicine in 1976. Sir George Alleyne was given the honorary title of Professor Emeritus after leaving the UWI in 1981 to assume the position of Chief of the Unit of Research, Promotion, and Coordination in the Division of Human Resources and Research at the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, Regional Office of the World Health Organization. He became director in 1995, and after re-election in 1998, completed a second four-year term in January 2003. In 2003, he was elected Director Emeritus of PAHO. From 2003 until 2010, he was the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in the Caribbean. Sir George Alleyne served as Chancellor of the UWI from 2003 to 2010, and then 2010 to 2017. He was also a visiting professor at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, Johns Hopkins University, from 2003 to 2017. His years of distinguished service in the office have left an indelible mark in the history of the UWI. In addition to his service as Chancellor, Sir George has spent a total of 23 years working at the regional university. Throughout his accomplished career, he has received numerous awards, including prestigious decorations and national honors from many countries of the Americas. In 1990, he was made Knight Bachelor by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II for his service to medicine. And in 2001, he was awarded the Order of the Caribbean Community, the highest honor that can be conferred on a Caribbean national. The Barbados-based Chronic Disease Research Center, one of the lead agencies in the fight against chronic diseases, was recently renamed in honor of Sir George. The acclaimed medical research unit is now the George Alleyne Chronic Disease Research Center. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome to the podium our 2008 honoree, Chancellor Emeritus Sir George Alleyne.
Madam Chair, Mr. Principal, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you all warmly. But I wish to welcome most especially my wife, Sylvan, and my daughter, Carol, and my granddaughter, Cherise, and my sister-in-law, Helen. It's always good to have one's best critics in the audience, because you get to hear afterwards how well or badly you've done. But it also gives me great pleasure to welcome the Honorable P.J. Patterson. I don't think there's anyone else here who was at Mona in our days, except Roy, perhaps, who was at Mona in our days. I have a great affection and admiration for this gentleman who has but one fault, that he belonged to another hall. But that is a fault he's not been able to correct. But he has overcome it, and has become a man of great distinction, for whom I have a great regard and affection. First of all, though, let me thank you, Camille and Archie, for the arrangements you've made for this week. It's been a most gratifying experience. It's been full of emotion for me and for Sylvan. It has brought back memories of times past. It has brought back and probably deepened, if it needs to be deepened, the firm and unswerving conviction of the value of this institution and the role that this institution can, must, and should play down through the years. There have been some light moments. I went to the Caribbean Day this morning and ate cuckoo and native Barbadian cuckoo and Jamaican blue drawers. They're slightly different. They're both made with corn, actually, although we call them conky in Barbados. I think Blue George is a more appropriate name, actually, for it. But the culinary aspect of it was preceded by a walk through the Hall of Memories. I think that was the name of it. I can't remember the exact name of it, in which there were pictures and memorabilia of the years of the university, starting from the first thought of a university. And it brought back to me various reflections of why we are here and how we came to be here, and some of the effort that must have been put into bringing us here. When I recalled, it was documented that in 1943, when the British Colonial Office set up a group to think of education in the colonies, and you can imagine at the time when Britain was at war, and his own future was in doubt, they still thought of tertiary education in the colonies. Quite remarkable, actually, and that should have been succeeded by the events that you well know. This week also brought back to me how the values of tradition, and a tradition started, and I am conscious of the fact that I'm following the footsteps of Elsa Leah Riney, the previous honoree. And thank you very much, Elsa, for being here this evening. This is a week of commemoration, of remembering, and it has not escaped me that it was on February the 16th, 68 years ago, that our first Chancellor, Princess Alice, was installed with pomp and ceremony in the Mona Valley. In Princess Alice's speech, she referred to universities, I quote her, as the best of all beacons. And she framed ours as serving to guide the spirit of mankind into the deep and safe waters of wisdom and understanding. My memories of the past years are many, perhaps too many to conjure up here, but I do recall many of my professional colleagues whom I treated when I was a practicing physician. And I remember one especially, a professor especially, who had a rare infection which puzzled us enormously. We argued at length about the appropriate treatment to be followed, but eventually he agreed with me and he recovered. And he gave me afterwards a beautifully illustrated history of medicine. And I continue to be fascinated by it and to be humbled when I appreciate, in one sense, how far we have come. In another, how basic are the efforts of man to restore health, and how fundamentally important is health to the human being. And indeed, the only genuinely non-renewable resource is our health. As I contemplate the progress of the science of health over the course of my professional life, I also reflect on the place of health in the hierarchy of the social values that nations and institutions like ours seek to preserve. So this lecture is a humble attempt to frame some of the more important understandings of health and disease of my time with an appreciation of the past and some visions of the future, if indeed one can ever envisage the future. It is also framed in a sense with some awe at the acceleration of the pace of the discoveries and the innovations that have influenced and will continue to influence health, hopefully for the benefit of us all. Medicine and religion have strong links which go far back in time, and the lack of precise knowledge made it natural to associate disease with some divine intervention. And early medicine was very much the province of priests. Disease was caused by spiritual powers and was a visitation of the gods. So in the face of ignorance, it was not unreasonable to attribute disease to demons and ritualistic practices to exorcise them. And these were part of the priest's craft. And to some extent, you know, these practices exist even today, although I often say that there's a vast difference between the trephining or perforation of the skull by the sorcerer. This one time this was felt as a way to relieve the demons and to relieve the pressure, and sometimes to accelerate your cognitive capacity to do a trephine and expand the borehole in your head. And I said that this is a little different from the boreholes of the modern neurosurgeon. There are certainly many accounts, but according to my history, scientific medicine had its origin in the 5th century BC in southern Italy, where the famous mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras settled. It was here that anatomy and physiology were first studied, but this was soon overtaken and surpassed by the famous school of Kos under the leadership of Hippocrates, known for his famous oath, which laid down the principles of professional practice. And you know, many of the aspects of Hippocrates' system of diagnosis, based on careful history, observation, examination, are relevant today. And I tell the story that when I was a medical student, no, I just graduated actually. No, I was still a medical student. When we were taught, of course, that the basic approach was inspection, palpation, percussion, and auscultation. And there was he was in the class, 2 classes below me. He had to examine a patient with hemorrhoids. And he inspected, he palpated, he percussed. And as he was about to put the stethoscope, the chap said, "Doc, the trumpet don't go there, you know, sir." But in relation, Hippocrates had much to say about the cause of disease. And Hippocrates wrote once, "In the first place, the science of medicine would never have been discovered, nor indeed sought for, were there no need for it. If sick men fared just as well eating and drinking and living exactly as healthy men do, and no better on some different regimen, there would be little need for the science. But the reason why the art of medicine became necessary was because sick men did not get well on the same regimen as the healthy any more than they do now." And I think there are few, if any, modern physicians who would disagree with him. With the appearance of the pestilence and plagues in Europe, we saw medicine plunged into the dark ages of rigid empiricism and erasure of the scientific approach. And this was then followed by the Renaissance, and then what is described as a golden age of discovery in the 17th century, when the microscope revealed the intimate mysteries of living cells. Then the 18th century was the age of enlightenment, which really set the solid foundation for scientific medicine. And perhaps the most significant advance of that was Jenner's discovery of vaccination, which probably is the most important public health intervention ever discovered. I'm always intrigued by some of the stories of the various persons who practiced then, and one was a Scotsman who called John Brown, who lived in this age, and he divided diseases into two groups, the sthenic, as he said, or the strong, or the asthenic, or the weak. And John Brown had two kinds of treatment, alcohol and opium. Yeah, they could cure anything. Then came the 19th century, when the mystery of infection was finally solved, and antisepsis found its way into medical practice, along with the revolutionary discoveries in microbiology and other disciplines. Obviously, this is a very superficial account of centuries of discovery, but the overwhelming discovery, the overwhelming impression I have from my reading of my history is an ever-accelerating train of discovery, an ever-accelerating application of new concepts, new technologies, which is reflected in the rate of improvement in the health of the world as a whole. Some of the stories of the classical era amused me even in high school. We were taught about Aesculapius, which was such a great doctor that he could raise the dead. And this upset Pluto mightily, as in raising the dead, he was reducing the number of souls in the underworld. So Pluto complained to Zeus, who killed Aesculapius with a thunderbolt and took him to Olympus. So you see, even in those days, it was unethical to steal another person's patients. Aesculapius had several children, but his most famous were his daughter Panacea, who could cure everything, and the other daughter was Hygeia, whose domain was public health, which included feeding the temple serpents. And their name and the derivatives have persisted even today. But I wish to leave ancient history, that brief account, and fast forward to my personal appreciation of some of the major concepts and practices that have framed health and disease in my time. The first is the conceptualization of the changing nature of disease. In 1971, epidemiologist Abdel Omran described three stages of what he described as the epidemiological transition. There was first the age of pestilence and famine. Mortality was high and fluctuating, low and variable life expectancy between 20 and 40 years, the age of pestilence and famine. And this was succeeded by the age of receding pandemics, mortality progressively declining, average life expectancy increasing, population growth being more sustained. And then the third is what is described the age of degenerative and man-made diseases. Mortality continues to decline and eventually approaches stability at a relatively low level. And others, including myself, have pointed out that stage 2 represents basically the age of the infections, the age of the infectious diseases. And this stage 2, the age of the degenerative and man-made diseases, this is the stage of the chronic non-communicable diseases. And we've seen this play out in Jamaica and in the Caribbean. When I came here in 1951, it was clearly the age of receding pandemics, the age of infectious disease. Malaria was rife. Pneumonia was a dreaded killer of men and women, young and old. Thousands of children died from gastroenteritis and respiratory infections. They died from vomiting sickness. They died from hypoglycemia, from ackee poisoning. Hookworm was rampant, and one could still see patients with yaws. Our public health lecturers would take us to the country and show us the various stages of yaws, the crab yaw, the mother yaw. I don't think anyone here has seen a case of yaws in your lifetime. And there was an epidemic of poliomyelitis in 1954, which struck over almost 800 people, including the young persons in the prime of their lives who were struck down when John Golden founded really the Mona Rehab Center as a place for the rehabilitation initially of those from poliomyelitis. And we were medical students at that time when John Golden did not have enough physiotherapists. So he engaged us medical students to go to the valley and apply, really give physiotherapy to the young people. I never forget young men, mainly men, being angry that they had been struck down by polio, cursing that why they, in the prime of their lives, would be incapacitated by polio, weeping because they had no chances of pursuing the athletic careers that were obviously before them if they had not been struck down. I was a young medical student then, and now I reflect, I did not have the experience sometimes to be empathetic enough to deal with some of the angst and the anger that was present in those young people. Jamaica has obviously passed through the stage of pestilence and famine and was then clearly at the stage of receding pandemics and numerous infections. But the situation here and in the Caribbean as a whole is a classic example of the truism that we are victims of our own success. It is because we have passed through and overcome, for various reasons, which we can go into, including those of the technological advances, the primary infections, we are now firmly in the era of the chronic non-communicable diseases. And the research into the local problems, the appearance and appropriate use of antibiotics, the growth of public health, with some exceptionally strong leaders in public health, have led us to being firmly in the stages of the man-made diseases. This has been well described for Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean, and we have seen throughout the Caribbean the dizzying growth of these diseases: heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer, chronic respiratory diseases. And during the period 2000 to 2008, the top 3 causes of death in the Caribbean were stroke, diabetes, and ischemic heart disease. And these chronic diseases are linked to 7 out of every 10 deaths in Jamaica. 7 out of every 10 deaths. Obesity is increasing in all age groups, but especially in children, and this presents major challenges to us in the health system. Amran attributed this to the biophysiologic and socioeconomic factors, as well as what he described as the psychological or emotional factors which influence family size and the practices of child rearing. But much of the transition here has been driven by behavioral change derived from a better economic situation and also fostered by aggressive commercial advertising. We must not forget also, as Dr. Alleyne will tell you, that the population is aging. The transition to the 3rd phase, however, did not stop the emergence of the HIV epidemic, which ravages the Caribbean and brought out some of the worst in our society, as it exposed significant stigma and discrimination based in great part on rampant homophobia. The countries have made considerable progress in this stage, and the epidemic also spurred much regional cooperation. The second phenomenon, which has been significant for me, was the rise of the notion of collective responsibility for health of the people and the growth of global, international, and regional health. The growth of international concern for health was not primarily for health reasons at all. It was simply and purely because disease impaired commercial traffic. Cholera epidemics could impede maritime traffic, as Garcia Marquez points out beautifully in his famous novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. The world's major maritime nations, they sought agreement on measures to prevent the entry of cholera from infected countries, mainly through quarantine. And the Pan American Health Organization was founded as a result of that kind of thrust in 1902, primarily as a mechanism for informing member countries about epidemics and the means of controlling them. And the growth of this cooperative spirit globally had its apogee after World War II with the formation of the World Health Organization, which had noble aspirations, and one can't help but be thrilled by its constitution, which speaks to the, and I quote, "the enjoyment of the highest standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being, without distinction of race, religion, political belief or economic, social conditions. And it goes on to state, the health, and which I believe firmly, the health of all peoples is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security. I would see the growth of regionalism in Caribbean health. In spite of the demise of the West Indies Federation, the health ministers stuck together, and the growth of the Caribbean community with a strong health section was a major factor in coordinating health activities in the Caribbean. And much credit is due to Philip Boyd, some of whom knew Philip, a public health giant who headed the CARICOM Secretariat's health desk. He was a major force in mobilizing, cajoling, browbeating, encouraging, inspiring collective action for health in the Caribbean. And numerous plans and strategies for public health were developed, some of which, in fact, predated the global efforts by WHO. It has not been the first time that the Caribbean has been the vanguard in terms of public health. There has been impressive improvement in population health in the Caribbean. If you look at all our indicators, improving. And tribute must be paid to the several outstanding public health practitioners, especially the nurses who made this their life's work. For me, the next major change that I saw has been the perception of health itself in relation to human development. The health of the individual and the health of the population, they were seen as a good in and of itself. Health was a good in and of itself. 16 years ago, I was fortunate to be co-chair of one of the working groups of the WHO Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, chaired by Jeffrey Sachs. And we met and overcame considerable resistance to the idea that health could not only be a constituent part of human development, but health could be instrumental as well. We could postulate several mechanisms through which health contributed to economic growth and poverty reduction. A healthy individual and a healthy population are productive. And interestingly, it can be shown that the benefits of education are amplified and extended with increased lifespan and increased health. There are tons of data to show this. I've often cited one of the more dramatic experiences closer to home in the demonstration by the famous George Giglioli in what was then British Guyana. What George Giglioli did, he noticed that many of the mine workers had hookworm. So he decided to treat them with oil of chenopodium. I mean, it really buggered their liver, but never mind. He treated them for their hookworm. They got rid of their hookworm. And what he demonstrated is that after they got rid of their hookworm, they actually could shovel more ore at the mine face, proving to the mine supervisor it was a good thing to have healthy workers. But as an aside, I must point out, I often do, this always amuses some of my listeners, that good health, good nutrition leads to better height. And I also always point out that tall men earn more than short men. The appreciation, not everyone stand up at once, not everyone stand up at once. The appreciation of the role of health was noted in the famous declaration of the CARICOM heads of government in Nassau, which stated, the health of the region is the wealth of the region. I'm not being hypersensitive when I react very negatively to the omission of health as an important ingredient for the human capital needed for economic growth. And I notice, and this is one of my bête noires, I say economic growth and not economic development. We often in the social disciplines have ceded the list to the economists who have tended to equate development with economic growth. That is a bad scene. And I always say, if you mean economic growth, say economic growth. If you mean human development, which has economic growth as but one component, let us be clear about it. And one lecture I gave elsewhere, I asked everyone to put his right hand on his heart and say, I will never use development again without an adjective to qualify it. Development by itself is a nonsense. It really doesn't mean anything if you just say development alone. It means nothing. You have to qualify what kind of development you need. So I'm not going to ask you to put your right hand on your heart, but I'll ask you to follow me and be very, very skeptical when they try to persuade you that economic growth is the only aspect of human development. But the final and perhaps the most significant major change I have observed is the growth of technology in health and medicine and the almost unstoppable technological imperative that can play itself out for good or ill. It is both alarming and comforting to hear and read of the advances in every aspect of human biology. The deciphering of the genetic code in 1953 was just the beginning of the explosion of molecular biology, and the sequencing of the human genome in 2005 with immense diagnostic and therapeutic potential. The Human Genome Project has to be one of the greatest scientific advances of all time. Now the technology is such that there may be few places in the body that are not available to inspection and biopsy. And the advances in the technical sphere are just as outstanding. Now the gallbladder and the appendix can be removed through the mouth. As our gastroenterologist friend, Dr. Angam Brown, will tell you, there are cases where the uterus is removed through the mouth. And I must tell you, the person who pioneered this approach is a gentleman called Tony Kalu, one of our graduates who is the chief of gastroenterology at Johns Hopkins. He pioneered the technology, first removing gallbladders through the mouth, then removing the appendix through the mouth. So if you want a scar outside, you go through the mouth, put a little hole in the stomach, and just pluck out the gallbladder. And now, because of advances in immunology, surgical procedures that were previously impossible are now carried out routinely. Organ transplants are now commonplace. We now have face transplants. And recently, I read of an impending head transplant. So when we say that in jest, though it might happen, the personal technological innovations have brought problems with themselves, such as the relationship between the patient and physician. There was a time when technology was the handmaiden which assisted in the diagnosis and management of the patient and his or her problem. But unfortunately or unfortunately, as the diagnostic technology becomes more sophisticated, there's a tendency to rely on its output and to ignore the voice of the person who is the only one who knows of his illness or his disease rather than his pathology. And sometimes I worry that there's a danger that a physician becomes so fascinated and driven by his or her technical skills and the urge to deploy them that the individual is merely a canvas on which his or her art is displayed. Now, one of the most important technological innovations of this period has been the development of antibiotics. And the modern era began with, I remember the days as a young student having to receive intramuscular penicillin every 4 hours. And anyone who's had to read that with a dull needle will know what injections are like. That was a time when penicillin was so scarce that not in our hospital, but someplace in Britain, they collected the patient's urine so they could recover the penicillin from the urine so it could be used again. The modern era began with Paul Ehrlich, who developed salvarsan for the treatment of syphilis, and then the synthesis of sulfur drugs in Germany, and the serendipitous discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming. And the period between 1950 and 1970 was the golden age of the discovery of antibiotics. And I don't know how many of you know that our own chemists actually discovered and produced an antibiotic called MonaMycin. And they produced it from a soiled organism, Streptomyces jamaicensis, but apparently it was not suitable for human use. And the magic of the antibiotics led some to predict that the age of infection was over. This, of course, is a premature declaration of victory because, as has been noted, the microbes are much smarter than man, they multiply more rapidly than man, have been here before man, and will probably be here long after man has disappeared. But it's not only in the personal care medicine that new technologies have become available and necessary. The science of population medicine has grown apace, and the emphasis is on addressing the cause of causes, as the famous Jeffrey Rose put it. So here we have seen governments required to use their powers of regulation, taxation, legislation to influence population behavior. And in the case of the new epidemic of the chronic diseases, this represents the major mechanism for changing the environment such that the healthy choice becomes the easy choice. Now, I have to argue here for another approach of population behavior change, which I'm predicting will find universal application. It's in the field, relatively new field of behavioral economics. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the developments in this particular field. And in behavioral economics, it plays upon the inherent irrationality of human behavior and finds methods to change that behavior without government intervention. Let me explain. In the neoclassical economics, the thesis is still, those who are of the neoclassical school, is that man is inherently rational. And mankind seeks to maximize his or her utility function. But what has been shown by behavioral economists, that man is what is called bounded by rationality. Man is surrounded by information, whether he or she is a victim. For example, we know that certain things are bad for us. And theoretically, according to economists, we should avoid those things that are not good for us. But we still do them. We still do them. The irrationality of human behavior is such that it often runs counter to the dictates of the neoclassical economists. And the field of behavioral economics has developed to apply some of the thinkings of psychology to the neoclassical economics. How can you put in place mechanisms to persuade people to take things that are in their interests? That is really the basis of it. And there are two economists who have got the Nobel Prize recently, not so much recently, Danny Canahan and Carl Taylor got the Nobel Prize recently because based on a lot of his work, Britain, for example, created a special unit, which they describe as the nudge unit, in which they try to find ways and means of nudging people into a certain form of behavior that does not necessarily imply government regulation. Of course, the argument by several people is that you should not let government off the hook, that the government should be there to apply regulation, taxation, etc., as means of compelling certain behavior. But the behavioral economists point out that the two methods should go in consonance together. You should be able to apply government pressures, apply taxes to reduce level of smoking, while on the other hand, apply measures to have people adopt positive behavior. This is of special importance in relation to the cardiovascular diseases. Just as an aside, if a person has a myocardial infarction and takes a certain set of pills afterwards, it can be shown there's an 80% chance of reducing their getting another myocardial infarction. However, people who have a myocardial infarction are put on these pills. 2 years later, 50% of them have stopped taking them, although they know that there's an 80% chance of not getting a recurrence if they take the pills. So the problem is, how do you persuade people to act in their own interest? So the whole area of behavioral, it is a little more complicated than that, but the whole area of behavioral economics is going in this direction. How do you influence behavior in ways which, in a certain sense, would indicate that the normal human being would opt to do otherwise? And I predict that this is going to be one of the growing fields of thought for the future in terms of we try to address some of the chronic problems with which we are faced. I mustn't forget the role of the University of the West Indies in this transition as a production of physicians, the research carried out, and the knowledge and expertise which was given freely to society were and continue to be significant factors in this transition. Now, on the basis of where we've come from, where we are, let me now look perhaps at the beyond, where we might be going. And while on the one hand, I have unbounded optimism and confidence in the genius of humankind, there's always a small voice that keeps reminding me of Icarus. You know, Icarus, he defied the gods, and with confidence in his new technology of his waxen wings, Icarus flew too near the sun with disastrous consequences. It is not only the extension of healthy life that raises concern for me, it is really about who shall live and who shall die, and what are the factors that set some in one group and some in another. And the advances, for example, in molecular genetics have raised the spectrum of boutique babies. Could those who can afford it, can they have the DNA of their offspring so altered to confer superiority and longevity? And what would be the ethics of such a measure? But this division in health possibilities is much more fundamental. It has its origins in the increasing inequality in the world. There's a fascinating new book by Haskell and Westlake called Capitalism Without Capital, in which they argue that more and more economic growth is depending on what they describe as the intangibles, as opposed to the tangibles which we are taught to believe are the major dictates of economic growth. Will this play itself out in the availability of the new technologies for treating disease or restoring health? But it's not only the equality of technology which is of concern, because there's good data that social inequality in itself is bad for our health. In terms of my concern, there's growing enthusiasm for the new precision medicine, in which therapies are targeted at the specific problem and not blunderbuss therapy, as much of our therapeutics is at the moment. It takes account of the individual's genetic makeup, the environment, and develops interventions that are individual specific. And one example is the growing field of the immunotherapy of cancer. It is possible to address certain cancers with immunotherapy designed specifically for that cancer. But these procedures at the moment cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient, meaning that only a very few will be able to avail themselves of it. Of course, the cost will come down, but the pattern of the main therapeutic advances being out of the reach of the poor is not likely to change easily or spontaneously. And the question is always put, who will make the decisions about the allocations of the scarce resources in this brave new world? It can't be the physician, because the physician's sworn responsibility is to seek the best for the patient. Clearly, there has to be a societal decision, and there should be a societal mechanism for deciding on the allocation of resources for as fundamental a matter as health. But we know that in a democratic system with competing priorities, this has proved enormously difficult, as I'm sure the Prime Minister could tell us. Health is not divorced from politics in terms of the decisions that have to be made on priorities that are often not following what we would consider the logic that is appropriate for health. Our future must embrace the Sustainable Development Goals, which speak of health and well-being for all. But the dominant inequitable social arrangements, even in the wealthy countries, may make this extremely difficult, because some may not benefit from the technological innovations that will undoubtedly occur. The world has embraced the idea of universal health coverage as a powerful instrument to attain that goal. And one of the basic theses is that all interventions which promote and protect health should be available to all and be financed from the public purse. That is utopia almost. And one approach has been called progressive universalism, which involves making all facilities available to all with the idea of incorporating the more expensive technologies progressively as the country's capacity to afford them increases. Perhaps the future lies in designing what is described as a health benefits package, and Chile is one of the major exponents of that in our region. They spell out specifically the services that should be available universally, the cost of them, and make sure that the services that they spell out, the government can afford. The contents of this package will depend on the local health context, the capacity of the health system, and of the country's financial resources to fund it. The logic is impeccable, but there will still be countries in the world which prefer the opaque heuristics or political criteria to determine what should be available and to whom. And unfortunately, the smaller the pie, the fewer the resources, the more difficult governments find it to carry out the kind of analysis to make that determination of a certain minimum that should be available to all. It is a truism, but it happens all over the world. Theoretically, there's no limit to income inequality. Theoretically, there's no limit. Theoretically, there's no limit to how much wealth each person can accumulate. Theoretically, there's no limit to income inequality. But it is possible to imagine a world in which health equity is a real possibility. Because in a sense, there's a certain limit to the health which you can have. So although there may be no intrinsic limit to health, to income inequality, theoretically, there may be some kind of a limit to health inequality, and it's possible to dream of a world in which there's more health equity. There are some who think more grandly. Yuval Noah Harari, in his recent book, Homo Deus, those who haven't read it, I recommend it. He's written two books, one called Homo Sapiens, one called Homo Deus. They were some of the best books I've read in the last couple of months. And Harari points out that there'll be a new agenda for this millennium. And humankind, having kept famine, plague, and war at bay, humankind in a new millennium, having done these and having protected the ecological equilibrium, humankind will seek immortality, happiness, and divinity. For most of us, however, from this part of the world at least, and now and into the beyond, the goal is not immortality, but the goal is health equity. The dream is really the essential four goals of medicine, and to have them in ample and equitable form. And these four goals are: one, the relief of pain and suffering; two, the promotion of health and prevention of disease; three, the forestalling of death; and four, promotion of a peaceful death. I often cite the last one, the fourth, as the facility to die with dignity. This should be a right to be able to die with dignity. And so I trust that in the next 70 years, our University of the West Indies will play its part through its research, its service, and especially its teaching in plumbing those depths of wisdom and understanding of which Princess Alice spoke. It will so plumb those depths of wisdom and understanding that they will help the Caribbean people to achieve with equity the four essential goals of medicine of which I spoke. Thank you.
Before you sit, Sir George, or you may sit for a second, I'm going to ask you to come back up, and Principal, we're going to ask you to come and present to our honoree a special token from the Mona campus.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed.
You wanted to say? Want to say anything, Principal? Okay. Okay, well, we hope when you look at that, Sir George, you will remember this week, this occasion, and all of us who love you so dearly. Thank you so much for those words. So this has brought us to the end of this part of our evening's activities. And it's just left for me to thank you all for being here and to thank persons who have had some contribution to the hosting of this week and the hosting of today's function. We must start by thanking our marketing and communications team, this year led by Ms. Kadian Martin, who is our acting director of marketing and communications. We thank the team, they're here somewhere. We thank our students who have been our ushers, who have been our tour guides, who have just been amazing for the entire week and this evening. So let's hear it for our students. You know, each time I hear a new set of voices, I realize that the university's singers will live on forever. We always have new voices coming on. Irvin, you are delightful. Thank you so much for being here this evening. We, of course, want to thank the Faculty of Law for hosting us this evening. We want to thank the MITS for the hosting of all the aspects of the technology. And, of course, our now calling the PVC for photography, Mr. Aston Spaulding, who is always on hand to ensure that we do things right and get it in the media. He knows who to take and where to send it and all those things. Chancellor and Lady Alleyne, we thank you ever so much for your contribution to the University of the West Indies, to the Mona campus, to the region, and indeed to this world. Thank you ever so much for all that you have done. We'll always be happy to have you with us, and you'll always be my Chancellor, Chancellor Emeritus George Alleyne. We're now going to invite you for refreshments. Thank you all. Thank you, clap yourselves as Miss Lou Style. Miss Lou Style, yes, thank you all for being here. And we invite you now to join us for some refreshments as we bring to a close our homecoming and commemoration week for 2018. Thank you all so very much.